Hello and welcome to this episode of In Discussion With from Pharmacy Update Online. Today I'm talking to Professor Martin Hewison about vitamin D and its role in autoimmune disease. So please, could you start by introducing yourself?
My name's Martin Hewison. I'm Professor of Molecular Endocrinology at the University of Birmingham. I'm interested in all things around endocrinology, but over the last 30 years, perhaps more than that, actually, I've worked primarily on vitamin D and different aspects of vitamin D.
Can you give us a brief overview of your role, what your current job involves?
I teach, obviously, because I'm at a medical school in the university, so I teach a lot of things in and around endocrinology, so not just vitamin D, different hormones as well. But I'm primarily a researcher, and I research on vitamin D, and that in itself is actually quite a wide spectrum of research. I have some interests in clinical aspects of vitamin D. We still have rickets in the UK, for example. We're developing new assays to better measure the status of vitamin D in individuals, and also have an interest in the molecular cellular side of vitamin D, how it works at a basic molecular level. And that incorporates a wide range of things, looking at vitamin D. And recent project, for example, has been on vitamin D and type 1 diabetes. But we're also interested in vitamin D in the immune system. And the topic of today, of course, vitamin D and autoimmune disease.
You and some colleagues recently published a review dealing with vitamin D and the interconnections with autoimmune disease. And that's what we're going to discuss today. Could you just start by giving us a quick reminder? What is vitamin D? Where do we get it from? And why do we need it?
So it's interesting, actually, because this is the 100th anniversary of the discovery of vitamin D this year. So vitamin D was discovered as a molecule that would prevent rickets, the bone disease rickets. And it's a molecule that's primarily for us is produced in the skin by the action of sunlight. So this vitamin D starts off as a cholesterol-like molecule in our skin, and when sunlight, UV light, hits our skin, it converts it into vitamin D. So in a way, vitamin D is very similar to many of the other steroid hormones in that it's derived from cholesterol. And we do get most of our vitamin D that's in our circulation from the action of sunlight on our skin. I know it's difficult to believe in a country like the UK, but we still do. We can get some vitamin D from foodstuffs, fatty fish, for example, mackerel, herring. They have quite a lot of vitamin D. Mushrooms, for example, interestingly, have quite a lot of vitamin D in their tissue. And there are some countries where foods are fortified with vitamin D. So if you go to North America, for example, you'll find that milk and orange juice is often fortified with vitamin D. But whatever the source of vitamin D we get, we have to convert that in our body into actual active vitamin D. And the first step takes place in the liver, and it produces a molecule called 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And this is interesting because it's the form of vitamin D that's most commonly measured. So if we talk about somebody being vitamin D deficient, it's because they have low levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D. But this molecule is not the active form of vitamin D. You have to have another further metabolic step, which takes place primarily in the kidneys, produce something called 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. That's what's known as the hormonal form of vitamin D. That's why it's incorporated into endocrinology, and that it's released from the kidneys in very small amounts and acts on distal tissues. And that's primarily its function, is to help you bring calcium and phosphate minerals from your diet into your bloodstream. And that's how vitamin D protects against rickets. It brings calcium in from our diet. And that's the principal function of vitamin D when it's a hormone, when it's acting in an endocrine fashion. So for many years, of course, that was how vitamin D was perceived. But we now know that there are other actions of vitamin D as well.
So that was the endocrine functions of vitamin D. Your review also talks about paracrine and intracrine functions of vitamin D. What do these terms mean, and where does vitamin D fit in?
Really, this stems from work that was carried out over the last 25 years, but certainly in the last 20 years, there's been a big interest in how vitamin D is metabolized outside of the kidneys. So we know that there are many tissues, many cells that are able to do that activation step, that conversion of 25-hydroxyvitamin D to hormonal 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. They can produce the active form of vitamin D, and they also have the receptor for active vitamin D. Now, both the endocrine and paracrine actions of vitamin D require a receptor that will respond to the hormonal 1,25-dihydroxy form of vitamin D. So outside of the classical bone protection endocrine system, there are many tissues that can both make active vitamin D and respond to it. And one of the major areas where this is seen is in the immune system, where cells such as macrophages, dendritic cells, are able to make the active form of vitamin D, and they can respond to it as well. And that can modulate immune responses in that individual. So the idea here is, of course, is if you supplement with vitamin D, you may be able to enhance those immune responses. And conversely, of course, if you're vitamin D deficient, it may be that you have an impaired immune function in relation to that metabolism. So that effect of vitamin D is known as an intracrine response, where everything takes place in the same cell. So if I have a macrophage and it produces active vitamin D and then responds to it and then creates a specific immune response, then that's an intracrine response. You can, of course, have the macrophage give up that vitamin D, that active vitamin D. They could release it to act on other cells in proximity. So a T cell that happens to be floating by, for example, could then be given the active form of vitamin D and respond to that as well, because when T cells are activated, they also express the vitamin D receptor. So that's then known as a paracrine response, something that happens by one cell producing a little bit of active vitamin D and then acting on another cell in the locality. So you have these rather confusing terms about vitamin D, but essentially what these intracrine and paracrine responses are saying is that it's possible to have a fully fledged vitamin D system outside of the kidney endocrine system. And that, in a way, then creates a whole other spectrum of potential responses for vitamin D beyond its effects in protecting against rickets.